Yeah, 'cause I have that SCAG document open with all the cities, so I think that's what froze my computer. The technical assistance data.
Oh, okay.
I think that's what froze my computer right now.
Actually, speaking of which, could we ask SCAG to like mine told me that I can ask for it in no, not mine, but Ping told me I can ask for it in raw data. Maybe we should ask for it instead of the PDF, because the PDF is kind of hard to use.
Yeah, well, I have the Excel raw data, so that's the one that froze my computer because it's basically every city in the SCAG area. So right now I was trying to close it, and every time I try to close it, it freezes. So yeah, but we have that. It should be saved in our.
Okay, are you guys ready?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna start. So we are now broadcasting, and our attendees are joining. So we will start in about a minute. We'll let a couple more attendees join. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's first community workshop on our housing element and safety element update. And it looks like we have several attendees joining. And so, Veronica, if you want to pull up the first slide. Thank you. And so thank you again for joining us this evening, October 22nd, for our Housing and Safety Element Update webinar. Next slide, please. So we're going to do some introductions. First, we'll meet the team that is with you tonight. We'll go over how to participate on tonight's community workshop, and then we'll give you a short summary of what we will cover. Next slide, please. So this evening you have myself. My name is Jennifer Savage. I am a senior planner with the City of San Clemente. And then we have two panelists from Veronica Tam and Associates. They are our Housing Element Update consultants. And we have one from City Place Planning who is doing the Safety Element Update. We have Veronica and Alexis from Veronica Tam and Associates, and we have Claudia from City Place Planning. Next slide, please. This evening, you will be able to participate in two forms. Your video and audio will be off, but you will be able to ask questions in the Q&A function. It's located on the lower portion of your video. It looks like the little box here on your right, and you can click on the Q&A. It'll pop up a box, and you can enter your question. We will get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Anything that we don't answer this evening, as well as the questions that we do, will be posted on the city's website. The second option to participate tonight are poll questions, and those we will ask throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. And in fact, our first poll is right now. We're going to go ahead and launch that. There are 4 questions, and you'll need to scroll down on that little pop-up box to answer all 4 questions. So if you go ahead and take a moment, the first question is, what type of participant are you? Are you a resident, a landlord, a business owner, a service agency, or none of the above? The second question is how long you've lived in San Clemente, if you are a resident. The third question talks about a little bit of the characteristics that you may have as a participant. And then the fourth one is why you're attending the webinar. So we'll allow a little more time for participants to respond. We have over half of the participants responding, almost 3/4. We'll allow about 15 more seconds. And thank you all for participating. I will go ahead and close the poll, and we can share the results. So you can see that the majority of the participants are residents of San Clemente. Of those residents, most have lived here more than 10 years. Let's see, there are some seniors and some single-person households, which is great. And most of you are here to learn about the housing element. Thank you. Okay, next slide. And tonight's agenda, we'll be discussing what the housing element is, the requirements of the housing element, and the characteristics of our community today. And we will be discussing what the safety element is and the requirements for the safety element. Last, we will discuss the process for our current efforts for these updates. And next slide.
And now I'm Veronica Tam. I will go over what is the housing element, what are the requirements, and some of the key elements of the housing element. The housing element is one of the 7 required elements of the general plan. It actually looks at how the city is going to plan for its share of the regional housing needs as determined by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. The housing element also looks at the housing needs in the community. What is the best way that we can accommodate the needs, addressing the needs not only of the current residents, but also future residents who may come to live in the city of San Clemente. The housing element also sets goals, objectives, and policy for housing, and identify the housing conditions and needs within the community. And lastly, the housing element is different from the rest of the general plan in that it has to be updated every 8 years according to statutory deadline. Being in Orange County within the Southern California area, the SCAC, the Southern California Association of Governments region, our housing element has to be updated by October 15, 2021. It does have a 120-day grace period, but the statutory deadline is established by state law. The housing element also is a little bit different from the rest of the general plan in that it has to be reviewed by a state agency for compliance, and the Department of Housing and Community Development is that agency responsible for the review, and the review is quite strenuous. The housing element, the city doesn't build housing. This housing element does not obligate the city to build housing. The private market builds housing. What we do in the housing element is to set the goals and policies, and if there's funding available, and also offer incentives if they are appropriate in order to facilitate and encourage the development of housing. So the housing element, through the city, through the housing element, sets the stage for the housing developers to build projects in the city that is consistent with the city's general plan, including its housing element, its zoning ordinance, and any other planning documents. The housing element has some key requirements, one being that you have to be able to accommodate the projected housing needs in the community as determined by the state. This whole process is called the regional housing needs allocation or regional housing needs assessment. The other requirement of the housing element is once you've gotten the allocation, you need to plan for it in terms of land use policy to accommodate it using your land use policy. But you should also have goals and policies to facilitate the production to meet this demand. The other requirements of the housing element is to preserve the existing affordable housing in the community. And certainly it's preserve and improve the housing quality in the city in general, but affordable housing in particular, recognizing that it's very difficult and very expensive to build affordable housing. When we talk about housing element, there is the requirement to facilitate housing for all income groups and people with special needs. And special needs groups as defined in state law are the elderly, the disabled, the homeless, the large households and female-headed households, as well as farm workers. And lastly, the housing element requirement is to promote fair housing. Once you have provided the housing opportunities, you want to make sure that people have an equal access to those opportunities. There are consequences of not complying with state law, and increasingly the consequences are more severe, particularly when it relates to housing element. It's the high risk of litigation. The housing element is the most frequently litigated element of the general plan. HCD, through recent legislation, was given the ability to monitor non-compliant housing element and refer them to the state attorney general for litigation. And most recently, the state did sue the city of Huntington Beach for continued inaction. And the city of Huntington Beach did settle for the housing element. There are also recent legislation that provide fines of up to $100,000 per month of out of compliance. And so far, no city is actually subject to that yet because most cities end up settling the lawsuit. The other recent lawsuits are the city of Pomona and the city of San Clemente back in the maybe 15 or so, the city was sued by nonprofits relating to compliance with housing element law. The city of Pleasanton was probably one of the first cities that was sued by the attorney general. They were suspended from issuing any building permits for more than a year. And it's not just housing permit, it's any building permit for over a year. The other consequence of non-compliance is ineligibility for state funds. There are infrastructure, transportation funds. There are also affordable housing funds that are contingent upon having a housing element complying with state law. There are also a lot of competitive grants that would give the city a higher scoring if you have a housing element that complies with state law. One of the key components of the housing element, as we mentioned before, is this concept of regional housing needs allocation. And it comes down from the states. Essentially, the states determines how much housing is needed in the near future, in the next 8-10 years or so. And then it allocates it to the sub-region and to the regions in the state. And Southern California Association of Government is the regional agency that received that number and is responsible to allocating it over this 6-county region of the SCAG region. That includes Imperial, Orange, San Bernardino, Riverside, Los Angeles, and Ventura County. So with the Orange County, the county received 183,000 units and 183,430 units for the next housing element update. And the city of San Clemente has an allocation of 978. Your next door neighbors are all receiving higher numbers. So in general, what the city received is higher than in the past, but it's fairly comparable to your immediate neighbors. The regional housing needs allocation is divided by income groups. Very low income, people who make no more than 50% of the area median income. Low income, people who make no more than 80%. Moderate are people who make 120% and above moderate income. And your housing element must show that you have adequate sites with appropriate density and development standards that can facilitate and encourage at least 978 units over the 2021-2029 planning period to meet this regional housing needs allocation. But again, it's not the obligation to build, it's the obligation to plan. So now I'm going to pass on to Alexis, and she's going to give a little bit of an overview of the characteristics of San Clemente today.
So thanks, Veronica. So one important part of the housing element is it's the housing needs assessment, which is establishing where the city is today and where it's been in the past few years. And before we jump into that, we want to know about your housing conditions. So Jennifer's going to launch a poll. This is for residents only. We want to know if you rent or own, and like we did previously, you're going to have to scroll down because there's a couple of questions. And question 2, what kind of housing do you live in? Question 3, with whom do you share your household? And number 4, how does your current housing meet your needs? So we're going to give you a couple of minutes there to go through those questions so we can learn a little more about you. How are we doing, Jennifer?
Yeah, we have about a quarter of the participants that have entered their questions. About half of our attendees are residents based on the previous poll. So we'll give them a few more seconds to go ahead and vote, or rather enter their answers. Okay, go ahead and end that poll and share the results.
All right, so based on that, it seems like the majority of the participants that are residents own. We have a majority in single family homes. They live with partners and or children, 80%, and that they have a sufficient size and number of bedrooms. So great. Next slide, please. All right, so starting with the population trends, as of January 2020, the population in San Clemente was about 64,581. In the past few years, we've seen that the rate of increase has slowed down. Since 1990 to 2010, the population grew by 55%. So that's that sharp increase you see in that chart there. But again, in the past 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, the population growth has only increased by 3%. And growth projections also predict this slowed population growth, so that there will only be a 5% increase in the next 15 years to around 68,000 people. Next slide. So now a breakdown of the current population, and back in 2010, so 8 years ago, based on this table, we see that there's an aging population. So the population over 65 years old, the senior population has actually increased, while the proportion of children has decreased. So we can see there in blue from 2010 to 2018 in red, both the categories of children between 0 to 4 and 5 to 17. We see a slight decrease there, while we saw an increase in the areas of 55 to 64-year-olds and 65 and over. And Veronica touched earlier on those special needs groups that need to be considered in the housing needs assessment. And this includes seniors, of course, and in San Clemente, senior-headed households actually make up 30% of the population, and 11% of households are actually seniors living alone. So again, it points towards a specific care for a senior housing. Persons with disabilities, they make up 8% of the population. Large households, which are households with 5 or more persons, 10%, and we have single parent and female-headed households with children have less than 5% each, and the homeless only make up less than 1%, so around 145 homeless persons since the 2019 point-in-time count. Next slide. And now when it comes to households and tenure, it seems that San Clemente has a lower percentage of renter households when compared to Orange County in California. So San Clemente has only a 34% of its households are renters, compared to Orange County, which is 43%, and California, which is 45%. This means that, just like our poll showed, the majority of households are owner occupied. And we've only seen a very slight increase of 2% in the past 8 years in this 10-year owner occupied. So it's stayed relatively stable. Next slide. And housing stock. So this is the type of housing, which includes single family, detached, and attached. multifamily, and mobile homes or others. Again, the majority of San Clemente's housing stock are single-family homes, and it's a slightly higher proportion in the county by about 6%. Also, another thing we look at in the housing needs assessment is the age of housing based on the year the housing is built, because housing age can be an indicator of the physical condition of housing. So usually we look at the threshold of 30 to 50 years old and more than 50 years old. At these points, housing is most likely to require at least some upkeep and rehabilitation. And in San Clemente, 26% of housing is over 50 years old, and 40% is between 30 and 50 years old, and only 34% less than 30 years old. All right, now a second poll about your housing conditions. I believe this one, there are 3 questions, but we ask you to please just answer the one that relates to you. Question 1 is for renters only. If you're a renter, how well is the property you rent being maintained? Number 2, for homeowners only, what, if any, major home repair or improvement do you have planned in the next 5 years? And if you're a landlord, what, if any, major housing repair or improvements do you have planned? So we'll give it a couple of minutes there too, a minute or so, to answer that. And if we do have any Spanish speakers, I believe the poll was in Spanish. It was on the website, so you can also refer to that. We can refer those questions to the Spanish speakers. I know it's a little bit wordier, so it might take a little longer for people to get through that.
Yeah, and for this question, we're interested to know for those that own your home as well as landlords, the same type of question, what the type of repair and improvement work is planned. And so it includes exterior or interior remodels, and then also specific components of housing that are quite important for living conditions. And those include roofs, water heaters, and the size in terms of home expansion. And so with, I think we had about half of our panelists were not actual residents of San Clemente. We're getting a little less participation on this poll. We'll go ahead and end that poll and share the results. So of the renters that responded, their property is well maintained. Of the homeowners that responded, they don't have any improvements planned. And of the landlord that responded, also no improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next slide. All right, Veronica kind of touched into this income distribution, the levels. So this is about the households in San Clemente where they fall their distribution within these categories. So for San Clemente, we have about 34% of households are considered lower income, meaning they earn less than 80% the area median income for the county. And we see that in San Clemente, a higher proportion of households are considered moderate or above moderate income, 66% compared to in the county where 55% of the households are moderate or above moderate income. Next. And now an analysis on housing affordability, again, based on income. And these are the income limits, as you can see in this table, the income limits that are imposed by HCD. and the affordable, based on an analysis, an affordable rent for an extremely low household would be around, and this is an analysis for a two-person household because the average household in San Clemente is around 2.1 or 2.3. So that's why we use the two-person household estimate here. So for an extremely low household, the affordable rent would be about $606. And affordable, it means that a household pays less than 30% of their income in housing. And an affordable home price would be $78,315. If we move down that table, a very low income household has an affordable rent for a one-bedroom unit of $1,117 and an affordable home price for $155,666, and so on. And again, housing is considered affordable if a household pays less than 30%. And in a rent analysis we did for this past August, the average monthly rent was around $1,892, which according to our affordable rent analysis, only an above moderate or above household would be able to afford without it imposing an extra cost burden. And the median sales price as of June 2020 in San Clemente was over $1 million. So again, for those, the affordability would be out of the range for these income categories that we have listed on the table. Next. And here we kind of break down the rental market in San Clemente a little bit better and a little more expanded. In 2015, we have a comparison between 2015 and 2020 rents for studios to units that have more than 4 bedrooms. We see that in 2015, the average rent was around $2,578 compared to 2020, where rents increased to $3,171. This equates to about 23% or $600. And given that we couldn't find any studio data for 2020, if we don't include this, the difference is about 11% or $303. But we see that the overall trend is still that rental rates have been increasing for all unit sizes, except for around the more than 4 bedrooms. So that only increased by 2%. Again, in our analysis, the household will need to make approximately $152,000 to be able to afford the average rental rates. And that's again based on the 30% income burden estimate. Next. Now for housing affordability and ownership, we see that again a breakdown between 2015 and 2019. San Clemente and Orange County, in that graph there, we see that San Clemente's housing prices have been above the county average, the county median, excuse me, but it has increased at a slower rate than the county overall. And when we see the median sales price of San Clemente compared to both the county and surrounding jurisdictions, it does have the highest median price, at least according to our June data, except for Dana Point, which exceeded the median home prices. And in this case, a household will need to make approximately more than $200,000 to be able to afford this median home sales price of $1 million. Next slide. And I kind of touched on this, the cost burden. So as I've been mentioning over and over again, the household spending 30% or more of their income on housing costs are considered cost burden. Households spending more than 50% of their income on housing costs, that would be considered severely cost burden. So similar to the data that I showed, when we break it down by tenure, about 54% of renters in San Clemente are considered cost burden, meaning they're paying 30% or more of their income on households. Owner incomes have a slightly lower percentage of cost burden, so only 34% of households. And overall in San Clemente, 41% are considered to be cost burden of households. Next. All right, last poll for our housing needs. If you can launch that poll. So here it's going to be a more general about stuff that we can incorporate into the housing needs. We have a couple questions here that we have to scroll through. So for number 1, which of the following are the biggest housing challenges for San Clemente? And we ask you to please select your top 3 in this case. All of these questions, I believe they're top 3. So we have the high housing costs, supply of new housing for sale, supply of new housing to rent, housing condition, neighborhood physical condition, and fair housing services. Number 2, we have which groups do you think have the highest need for housing and housing related services? Again, we ask you to select your top 3, and these are those include the special needs that we mentioned earlier: seniors, large households, persons with disabilities, young adults, veterans, military personnel, former homeless, or other or none of the above. Again, at the end of this, we'll give you some contact information in case you want to provide some of those answers to others. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't allow fill-in answers. And 3, which types of housing programs and activities do you feel the city should concentrate over the next 8 years? Again, we ask you to select the top 3: housing rehab, rental housing rehab, code enforcement, affordable housing development, first-time home buyer assistance, accessible units for persons with disabilities. We have housing for seniors, housing for the homeless, and housing discrimination and tenant landlord dispute resolution services. Again, it's a mouthful. We ask you to select the top 3 just so we have a better idea. What your opinion?
We have almost half of the participants have entered their answer, so we'll wait a little bit longer to see if we can get over half. And if you're still unsure, that's okay too. If you have a specific question, you're welcome to answer it in the Q&A, and we will try and get those answered this evening or on our website at a later date. Okay, so we have over half of our attendees have answered. I'll go ahead and, well, it looks like we're still getting a few more. We'll give it 5 more seconds. And I'll go ahead and end the poll. And we got 2/3. And the biggest housing challenge from our attendees tonight is the high housing cost with the supply of new housing for rent as the second highest or second biggest challenge. In terms of the highest need, seniors was top, with young adults coming in a close second. In terms of housing program and activities that the city should focus on for the next 8 years, majority chose affordable housing development, very telling. And then coming in second is housing for the homeless. And these are all important issues, but really good to know your thoughts on each of these. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Claudia Tedford, and I'm going to be talking about the safety element update tonight. The safety element is also one of the required chapters of the general plan. When you think about the general plan, oftentimes people think about land use and circulation and housing, but there are some other important aspects of the general plan. The safety element is one of them. Next slide, please. Thank you. The safety element, the purpose is really to reduce the potential short and long-term risk of death, injuries, property damage, and economic and social dislocation resulting from hazards that may affect the community. These types of hazards are fires, floods, droughts, earthquakes, landslides, climate change, and other hazards. So the general plan sets citywide goals and policies to protect the community from hazards, and not only to protect the community, but also to minimize the exposure and risk associated with these hazards and ensuring advanced preparation for hazardous events. So the current safety element was just adopted in 2014 as part of the Comprehensive Centennial General Plan update that the city spent a good amount of time updating. So you might wonder why we're updating the safety element. Well, there's a new requirement by the state that when the housing element is updated, a city or jurisdiction must also update the safety element. That's why we're doing the update. Next slide, please. Okay, and next slide, please. Thank you. There are some new safety element requirements that have been adopted since 2014 when the last safety element was adopted. So one is the state started out in saying that cities must address climate vulnerability and adaptation in their safety element. And then a couple of years later, they decided to tie it to the housing element update. And they said at a minimum, you should update flood, fire hazards, and climate adaptation. I'd like to mention that the city did just a year ago, October of 2019, they adopted a sea level rise vulnerability assessment. So that document and that work can be incorporated by reference into the safety element. We don't have to redo that, and that was done for the area that's essentially west of the I-5. The next legislation that the state adopted regarding safety elements are for jurisdictions that have very high fire hazard severity zones. And San Clemente does have some of these zones. They must work with CAL FIRE to prepare land use strategies. And these land use strategies are in place to protect buildings, infrastructure, and communities. And then the final new safety element requirement is that the safety element must identify developments that are in these hazard areas that do not have at least 2 emergency evacuation routes. That is 2 points, they must have at least 2 points of ingress and egress. And for those that don't have that, those will need to be mapped and included in the safety element. Next slide, please. Okay, next, what sections of the safety element will be updated? Because we're not going to update everything. As we said, it was just updated 6 years ago. There are some aspects of the safety element that are just fine, but we're looking at updating the things that have changed or responding to the legislation that has been passed in the interim. We'll be updating mapping in the element. So there's some new data on areas prone to landslides, flooding, and hazardous materials sites. With respect to wildfire, CAL FIRE is expected to update the high fire hazard severity zones in 2021. We're not exactly sure when in 2021 that will occur, but we'll be mapping any changes to those zones and incorporating the policies. We'll be working closely with CAL FIRE to make sure that the safety element reflects the policies that they're looking for. The current safety element also has a critical facilities map, and this shows things like reservoirs in the city and the location of schools and fire stations and City Hall. So we'll be updating that map. The location of City Hall has changed since the last safety element was adopted. So we'll be looking to, for any other changes that need to be made to that map. We'll have no change to geologic and seismic hazards. And cities have a lot of latitude on how they put together a general plan. Your city of San Clemente, chose to combine the noise element with the safety element. And there are no changes required of the noise element. So that part of the safety element will remain as is. Next slide, please. Okay, and we're gonna kind of finish up our presentation, the safety element portion of the presentation, with two polling questions. And I believe these are the last polling questions. But the first one is, which of the following safety element topics do you feel are most important to the residents of the city of San Clemente? And if you would please choose your top three. And the choices are earthquake hazards, including landslides, flooding, wildland and urban fire, radiological hazards, hazardous materials, and emergency services, preparedness, response, and recovery. And then the other question is, the city adopted a sea level rise vulnerability assessment in 2019. I talked about that a little while ago. What other climate change related concerns do residents care about? And for this one, you can choose all that apply. Rising temperatures, extreme precipitation events, drought, wildfire, or none of the above.
And while we wait for a few more responses to come in, we have received some questions in our Q&A format, so we will definitely get to those. Feel free to keep those coming. We have over half of the participants that have entered their responses in the poll. I'll go ahead and give you about 5 more seconds. And we will share the results. So the most important topics in the safety element for San Clemente residents, the top two were earthquake hazards and emergency services and preparedness. And in terms of what other climate change related concerns the residents care about, the top two were wildfire and drought, very, very related. Thank you. And next slide, please.
Well, oops. This is Veronica. Let me go back and talk about the process then. Originally, we wanted to kind of give you an idea about the overall process of the housing element and safety element. The housing element has a statutory deadline, and that's October 15, 2021. And the safety element has a similar deadline, but not as hard a deadline as the housing element. Essentially, state law says upon updating the housing element, you need to also update the safety element. So much of this process, this timeline, is developed primarily for the housing element with the safety element coming along. Obviously, we're doing some community outreach right now. We're also in the process of developing the draft housing element and safety element. We hope to get all of that done by about December of this year, and then present the draft housing element and safety element to the city council for review, and before we submit it to the state for review. As we mentioned before, the housing element has to be updated by a state agency and have to be reviewed by a state agency for compliance with state law. And we do plan to send that off to HCD around March next year. It takes probably at least 4 months to complete that process, because every round of HCD review requires 60 days. And we anticipate, or we hope to allow for at least 2 rounds, so that gives us more time to address that and the state's comments, and bringing back the housing element and safety element to review in about late summer, July and August, and begin implementing the housing element after the adoption of the housing element. After adopting the housing element, it needs to go back to the state for its final review, but that final review can happen anytime. With that, I think that concludes our presentation.
Yes, thank you. And again, thank you for joining us this evening. I know there is another broadcast that conflicts with this, so we do appreciate your participation. We have some questions that have come in, so we'll go through those, and Veronica, Claudia, and Alexis, if you feel comfortable answering them, I will pass them on to you unless they're more appropriate for me to answer. The first question was whether we'd be adding tonight's attendees to a distribution list for future meetings. Someone wants to be included in all of them, and we actually do have a distribution list that we can add you to. If you want to email me, I can add you to that list. And so, Veronica, it might be helpful to leave up that last slide. It had my email address. Again, my name is Jennifer Savage. I am a senior planner with the City of San Clemente, and my email address is savagej@san-clemente.org. Our next question is how large is the polling sample? That question came in for a specific poll, and the number of people varied across the poll. Certainly not an official poll. Not all the residents are on tonight's broadcast, but we will have other opportunities to provide feedback on your thoughts and what you find important for us to address in the housing element. So this one might be for Claudia or Alexis. For this next cycle, for the past cycle, actually, San Clemente developed more than 200% of the needed above moderate housing, but less than 50% at all of the other income levels. What will the city do differently this cycle to better meet the RHNA goals?
I think this probably is something that I should comment on. Building affordable housing, particularly for people who are at lower income, is very difficult because it requires substantial subsidies. I think, and also definitely adequate sites. And you have to, I think that's what we are doing this round. Staff is working, with us consultants, trying to identify more appropriate sites that could be used for facilitating affordable housing or low income housing. The city does have some funding available. In addition, the state has also amended the law regarding density bonus and making it more flexible to use the density bonus and also the requirements to go with the density bonus. So hopefully with the implementation of the new state density bonus requirements, there will be more affordable housing that can be built in the near future.
Thank you, Veronica. So our next question is about homeless. The attendee says, it looks like the Capistrano Unified McKinney-Vento numbers last reported were more than 3,600 homeless children. Do you know how many homeless children are in San Clemente, and is that a factor in planning for the housing element?
We don't have that information about homeless children in the school district because the definition of homeless is a little bit different. Based on state of California housing element law, we are supposed to use the point in time homeless count for San Clemente in terms of, for all of the jurisdictions in terms of planning for the homeless. That number is not the same as what the Unified School District would consider as homeless, because they do include children who may be living with family members or relatives or sharing housing. So that number is a little bit different, but in any case, we do look at homeless and as part of the housing element planning, and definitely homeless families versus homeless adults.
Thank you. So next question is whether these slides will be available. Yes, absolutely. They are available on our website right now. Please feel free to email me and I will give you a direct link. The slides are available both in English and Spanish. So if there are any organizations that represent Spanish-speaking community members, those resources are available. The next question is when we'll be taking community input about our housing element. So this is our first community outreach. It won't be our last. Certainly any input that you have now, you can email directly to my email address and we will incorporate it. There will be public drafts as a housing element available, as well as some other opportunities to provide input through surveys or polls. The next question is, will the city have a community advisory group participating in developing the housing element? And at this time, I don't have an answer for you on that, but we will provide some feedback for that on the website at a later date. The next question is, what sort of environmental documentation do you anticipate preparing with these updates? Veronica, do you want to take that?
Yes, we are actually anticipating an EIR to be prepared as part of the housing element, but at the minimum, it will be a mitigated NEC deck, but we are anticipating an EIR, environmental impact report. I think, Jennifer, you did miss one meeting, one question above. Is on related to the COVID as a factor in planning whether long-term leases at hotels, motels would be considered.
Oh, thank you. Did you want to address that one?
I think that's certainly something that we can talk about and to discuss with the city whether there is any possibility and whether there is funding for it. At this time, we're not at the point where we're finalizing the programs and policies yet, but that's certainly something that we can discuss with staff.
Thank you. So similar question to one earlier was whether we'll have a working group for the housing element. And we don't have any formal advisory group that I'm aware of just yet. But something important to note is that instead of focusing some work around specific individuals, we would like as much input as we can, taking advantage of some technology that has come around since the last housing element update. Really want to provide input from all community members. The next question is what other outreach are we planning? How will we ensure that we'll have sufficient input, and what is sufficient input? Yeah, great question. So something to think about is that there is no definition of sufficient input, but certainly it's a matter of the city providing outreach to as many community members as we can, ensuring that all community members are reached. Something that we do have to figure out is how we reach those community members that don't have access to technology for a number of reasons, as well as making sure that we have means to contact any of our community members that don't have English as their primary language. Let's see. And the next question is, will VMT analysis be included for the housing elements? And would facilitate projects by allowing them to tier off the VMT done for the housing elements? As it is difficult to address VMT on a project-by-project basis, especially for residential projects in suburban cities. Yes, our environmental review will have a VMT analysis. In terms of being able to tier off the VMT analysis for the housing element, ultimately will depend on those conclusions and the actual project that wants to tier off of the housing element EIR. The next question is, what is the status of the San Clemente's inclusionary housing study? When will the next public meeting be about this subject? So we are still in the draft process for that inclusionary housing program update. We don't have a definitive public meeting, but we're hoping to have our next study session with the Planning Commission and the Council in November or December. Question about SB2 funding. Did we say that San Clemente was not eligible for SB2 funds, or was that a typo on the slide?
Jennifer, let me answer that. I think actually that's neither. It's not a typo, and San Clemente is eligible. The slide's about if you are out of compliance. If your housing element is out of compliance, then you would become ineligible for SB2 grant. And so currently we are compliant, so we are eligible for SB2 grants. There will be other SB2 grant opportunities in the future, and that's also the reason why it's very important that we maintain a compliant housing element.
Thank you. Let's see, next question is, will the recording of this workshop be available on the city's website? If so, what part? I think it's an excellent workshop and can think of others who would want to view it but were not available tonight. Yes, that's a great question. Yes, the workshop is being recorded. It will be available on the city's website, all of it, all of the presentation. The polls and Q&A will not be interactive, but if the poll questions are available on the website right now. So if someone wanted to respond, they can certainly provide those responses to me by email, or if they want to drop it off a paper copy, they can do that as well. The last question we have right now is, when is the first time that a public draft of the housing element will be available?
I think based on our earlier process slide, we're not anticipating that to happen until maybe early next year. We are working on it right now, but the public drafts will probably happen in early next year.
Great, thank you. And certainly even before that, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you're welcome to contact me by email or even phone. And if you want to participate in all of our future outreach processes, we definitely do welcome that. That's our last question for this evening. Veronica, Claudia, and Alexis, thank you so much. Before we close it out, is there anything you want to add?
I think definitely encourage residents to look at the poll questions, even though they cannot actually participate in the polls, to provide comments on the housing element, your housing needs, and the things that you like to see in the city of San Clemente. You're not limited to the polls questions, but certainly submit your comments to the city. The more, the merrier.
Thank you. And thank you all again for joining us this evening. If you need help finding any of the resources that we have available so far, please feel free to email me or call me. I can walk you through finding it on our website or email you a direct link. Thank you, Veronica, Claudia, and Alexis, and thank you for everyone that joined us this evening. Take care.
Thanks.